Hello, hello, welcome. If you
Hello.
are here, hello. If you are here to see the session on the generosity crisis, you're in the right place. So welcome. Welcome to the generosity crisis, where Nathan Chappell and Brian Crimmins will answer the question, is philanthropy in a state of crisis? So let me go ahead and make some introductions, beginning with Nathan. As a thought leader, public speaker, inventor, and award-winning author, Nathan is one of the world's foremost experts on the intersection between artificial intelligence and philanthropy. Nathan serves as Senior Vice President of Donor Search AI, where he leads the AI deployments for many of the nation's largest nonprofit organizations. Nathan founded Fundraising.ai as a global collaboration focusing on data ethics, data equality, privacy, and security. Nathan is co-author, along with Brian Crimmins, of the award-winning book, The Generosity Crisis, The Case for Radical Connection to Solve Humanity's Greatest Challenges. Now, as for Brian, in addition to being co-author, Brian is a global leader in the social impact sector and a sought-after speaker. He is the first ever Chief Operating Officer of Chaminade High School, New York, his alma mater, and he is a strategic advisor to Changing Our World Incorporated, where he spent more than 22 years advising clients and nearly 14 as CEO of the firm. As COO of Chaminade High School, Brian oversees the offices of advancement, alumni and parent relations, campus facilities, communications and marketing, the treasurer, finance, and investments. I'm going to hold up this book that you all are seeing on your screen as you hear from Nathan and Brian. So without further delay, please welcome Nathan and Brian with some love in the chat.
Great. Thanks, Emily. Pleasure to be here, and thank you, Tammy, for putting on such a wonderful Transform 24. It's a pleasure for Nathan and I to be here. Looking forward to taking you through really the lessons and the highlights from our book that we were writing probably about 2 years before it actually came out, a little more than a year and a half ago. So it's really interesting to see where we were and now where we are today as it relates to the generosity crisis. And as we always like to say, it's certainly not a title you pick if you want to make friends, but we thought it was important based on the research and the feelings that we were having, talking to so many nonprofit leaders all over the world about what was happening with our pride and joy of philanthropy, that we really ring the bell and call attention to what we think was certainly happening. And unfortunately, it's played out, but we also believe there's a better days ahead. And we're really excited to not only cover the research of what we believe has led us to the generosity crisis, but to really take you through what are some of the things we can do to reverse the trend. So stay with us for the first half an hour, half of the presentation, excuse me, because we're going to take you through some of the hard reality of what we found. And as Nathan loves to say, we'll lift the plane back up and we'll bring you to certainly a brighter day. And thanks for all the great love in the chat and some old friends certainly seeing in the chat. So great to be with you all. So let us begin. So a real grounding first thing we want to talk about is, and this is something everybody on this conference knows all too well, and that is that nonprofits are, as we say here, special, essential, and uniquely American. Obviously, the nonprofit sector, for the most part, has its roots in America. And what most people don't understand is truly the impact, the scale that nonprofits have in our local communities, but also on the country's, on the national stage. And just to hit on 3 data points to give that context, there are roughly 1.6 million nonprofits in the United States. Those 1.6 million nonprofits employ more than 12 million individuals. And all that combined means that it roughly makes up 5.7% of the U.S. economy. So we're talking about a sector that is vital to the U.S. economy, to the work we do, and that is without saying the just tremendous work, whether it be in healthcare, education, social services, I could go on and on and on, that the nonprofits have in the impact that they go to work every day helping people every day. So it's a vital part of our communities, our nation, and another reason that we felt we needed to call attention to what we thought was happening as a, if you will, threat to the sector.
And actually, before you go on to the next slide, Brian, because this is what we do. Brian and I have to keep things interesting and go back and forth, and we love being able to present together. But the other thing, in addition to kind of philanthropy being a very strong American pastime, of course, there's philanthropy in most developed nations and many undeveloped nations as well. But the type of major giving that we have here and experience in the U.S. is really sets the pace for most of the world. The other part of this, though, as I was reflecting last week on some conversations with some friends, is that generosity not only is an American pastime, it's a pro-social paradox. The pro-social part of it is that, when we give, we also get back. And the largest study on generosity, it's actually done through Notre Dame, was called the generosity generosity paradox, or paradox of generosity. This idea that the more you give, the more you want to come back. And when we studied this throughout our book, we looked at throughout history, kind of the sense that, people give, and as a way, and if you just reflect for a second, often you realize that when you're giving, you're also getting back, and sometimes getting back more than what you had given. And so while this is this American pastime, it's also something that we're inherently built to do. So in context of that, Brian will share some more startling facts of, like, if that's true, then he can go to the next slide and then ask kind of the big question.
Right. So great points, Nathan. And so that the beginnings of that big question were when, at least for our journey, our story of Nathan and I putting this book together, goes back probably close to 10 years now, when Nathan, during my consulting days, was kind enough to bring us on board when he was working at City of Hope. And, as I've told people over the years, he and I would work pretty much a full day looking at what their advancement in their philanthropy and engagement programs were like. And still, I think we've both had a thirst to understand and talk some more. So found ourselves after hours chatting, having a meal, having a drink, talking about the sector that we both care so much about. And I think we were both at that time were feeling what's on this slide, that there was something on the horizon, if not already with us, that was causing a problem. And we both felt it was reaching a boiling point. And as I love to say, out of respect to Nathan, there's nobody who pours through the Giving USA report in detail more than Nathan. I think he takes a day or two off from work when the report comes out, just so he can go through every line item. And I'm talking about the footnotes in the back as well. And it was really through his knowledge of that, my knowledge of consulting with various clients, that we realized that this was becoming a boiling point. And it's something that we had to pay attention to. And thankfully, some folks started talking this way as well.
Yeah, and just kind of referencing back, and so those that don't know me, my orientation is 20 years in the nonprofit seat. So essentially, leading nonprofit organizations for 20 years, and for many years felt like I was alone, in the sense that we were every year, of course, asked to raise more money than the prior year. But when we were looking at the underlying data, realizing that we were raising more money from less people. And for many years, I felt like I was alone, which is probably why I got really interested in understanding kind of the global macroeconomic trends around generosity, why I started devouring the Giving USA report. And we're very fortunate in the US to have such a incredible body of longitudinal study. And I know Una Asili, who is just I'm like a total fanboy of, will be speaking later on this topic. But, one of the things that we've realized during that time was, well, first, that I was not alone, that there were many other people, and that while I was going through Giving USA for a number of years, and even looking at, advents in philanthropy, like the Giving Pledge that was started by Bill Gates and Buffett in 2010, that while all those great things were happening, there wasn't really any really strong movement that was outpacing GDP. There was no net increases in generosity as a total. But the troubling part was when we were getting into the footnotes and really reading a lot of the ancillary reports that we were getting, not from just the US, but from Canada and Australia and the UK, was that this was not just something that was happening to my organization or just to my team. It was not just something that was happening in my geographic region, but around the world, essentially, that more and more people were essentially calling into question, what does the tax status have to do with generosity? And the Generosity Commission, which is a subgroup that came out of Giving USA and the Giving Institute, really called this question, which should make most of our hair stand up on the back of our neck. And the question or the statement is so profound, is that the future of generosity in America is not guaranteed. Not knowing this information, Brian and I had already written a very dystopian chapter about people going to their local free clinic to find out it was closed, or getting an email that a grant research project was not funded, or the Philharmonic that they had always gone to was about to close its doors. And so when it became not just Brian and I talking about those things, we're like, okay, there's a moment in time where our sector needs to realize that what was is not what is and not what will be, and that we can take heed of this moment and really truly understand what's going on before we can envision a different result. And so the next slide just shows you the gravity of the downward trend. And of course, so we have some Canadians on the call, which is amazing. This graphic, which comes from Giving USA data, represents the percentage of households that give to traditional 501c3s. Brian and I openly call to question in our book whether or not there is a generosity crisis, but the giving to charitable organizations is on the 16% decline trajectory over the last 20 years. From 20 years ago, where 2/3 of Americans were giving to charity, now people that give to charity are essentially the minority with 49.6%. And if you overlay this over Canada, the trajectory looks exactly the same. It's just that the baseline is much lower than 49.6%. And Brian will talk about how this is not a new trend, but I think it's a new day in how we're interpreting it, and also how we're re-envisioning kind of a different future.
Yeah, and exactly that point, Nathan. I want to touch on two kind of bigger themes here, give some more color as it relates to the data and the downward trend that Nathan just touched on. One is, if you look at where 2008 to 2010 was, right around the great financial crisis, we were starting to trend downward in philanthropy from 2000 to 2008. But during the Great Recession, we really took a steep downward turn, and we've never recovered from that. We would often talk about it in my consulting life, that people took a depressionary mindset to the recession that we went through in 2008, 2010. And if you know what I mean by that, it means you start making changes in your lifestyle. You start making changes in your purchasing, and you start changing your behaviors when you're trying to get through a depression, even though it wasn't. It was a recession. But when people were losing 40% of their net worth in a month or two, it shocks the system. And so what I found really fascinating as we were doing our homework was two things. One, that we've truly never recovered from the Great Recession, albeit we were heading that way, but at a slower pace. And our thinking was sort of confirmed by the team at the Chronicle of Philanthropy. If you look on the screen where it says How America Gives, that was the Chronicle of Philanthropy in 2017, where they wrote about how, using 2015 data, they thought something was happening. They thought we were going down a slippery slope here. And in talking to them when we were doing our book, it was interesting to hear them say that they got really little to no feedback from that cover story, many articles, that they were worried that something had happened during the Great Recession that was maybe here to stay. And then you take the juxtaposition of their 2022 summer article that you see on the right there, The Giving Crisis, which is, when they put that out and they were talking about it, they were kind enough to actually mention that Nathan and I's book was going to be coming out in a few months. But the real main thrust of it was a lot of what we had in the book, and there was a lot of attention. There was a lot of conversation, a lot of webinars that sprung up from this. And so I think us as a sector, I think what Nathan was alluding to, was we were starting to come to grips within the last 2 to 3 years that something was amiss here, and that we had the ways of working, the results were not just always going to be there as they historically had been. And then 22 came about, and unfortunately, this also repeated itself, the year prior too. But 22, the latest data that we have, we had unfortunately all the wrong type of headline. I mean, we were breaking records left, right, and center, from the percentage of drop in charitable giving, 10.5%, that being the largest single drop since we've been recording data for 40 plus years. We actually had a 2.5% greater decline than during the Great Recession, when you just saw what that meant. We had the 2022 decline is 3.8 times larger than the average decline. So no matter how you looked at it and cut the data, the story was troubling. The one that I always look at and think about the impact that this had is the second from the top, where it says 13.4% decline in individual giving, which equated to approximately $49 billion was given out, which translated to more than 205 million fewer gifts. I mean, we're talking about seismic activity, not 2 million gifts, not 20 million, not 205 million fewer gifts. And as we all know, giving is such a habit forming thing, which is great. It's often tied to family tradition, etc. When that happens and there's a break, very, very hard to get people back in. All this to say, and when Nathan was crunching data pretty early on, I think when we were putting the book together, I remember him calling me. We used to meet every Monday afternoon, evening, for about a year and change straight. And I remember one afternoon he started the call by saying, "Brian, do you know that if we don't change the trajectory of the 16% downward trend we're on, giving will all but cease to exist in 49 years?" And I remember that, as he said earlier, the hair on my neck's standing up, because that is not, I've got 4 relatively young children, that's well within their lifetime. And that is a very troubling statistic in terms of what kind of world do we want to have for ourselves, for our children, for our grandchildren, knowing the important, critical role nonprofits play. If the traditional check writing philanthropy element of it is on a trend where within 49 years it's going away, I think we all have to stand up and certainly take notice.
So this is right on cue, because I just saw in the chat someone's asking, which always happens, like, but what about this, or what about that, and what about religion, what about taxes? And this is why, Brian and I, in hindsight, probably would have written our book with a warning label on the front that's like, "Don't read this book without a box of cookies next to you," because we spend quite a bit of time unpacking what is considered kind of the confluence of circumstances that have led to this. This isn't one thing. This is, and actually this has roots of going all the way back to the end of World War II, where people coming home from work and a hard day's work, instead of sitting on the porch and talking to their neighbors and learning and investing in their community, the television made its way into the home, and people became more isolated. So fast forward to today, where every person has a phone in their pocket, essentially a lot has happened since then. So we do spend quite a bit of time in our book, which we won't be able to get to in detail today, but Brian and I will each take 2 sides of this coin. So the first side of the coin of whether or not nonprofits are the victim or the culprit is really things that we've done to ourselves. And so I feel like I can speak to this as somewhat a chronic offender and part of the culprit mechanism. I spent 20 years in the nonprofit sector, doing a lot of these things. Now, and even in my view of how I invested in risky things. So I'll highlight these just very quickly, but like the lack of investment in the nonprofit community is laughable. Usually in a live audience would say, how many of you in your organization have a philanthropic R&D budget? And if we were all live today, you no doubt could hear people kind of laughing or giggling under their breath about this question, which is not a fake question. The reality is that our sector is woefully bad at investing in things that they are unsure about, and we need to get better at that. That goes alongside that aversion to risk, and also a lot of times using technology that just reinforces transactions, because they're the cheapest, less risky things to do. The incorrect hypothesis of people being fixed in time, that a donor or a prospect is that a donor or a prospect, not an individual that has a degree of connection to your organization. We'll unpack that. The one I'm going to go down to is the bottom right, is why we gave it more space, is that throughout my career, and the reason why I was the biggest offender of this is that I always believed that more was better. That if I could invest a little bit more to acquire a little bit more, even an incremental amount more, that I will have built a better mousetrap and actually have won the game. That we used to use terms that like build a better mousetrap, which is horrible. And I regret that so much, being, this is many years ago, but being into a world where Brian and I have unpacked really what is missing from our sector, which is really a true understanding of building connection. And we'll unpack radical connection for you in a little bit. But that nonprofits, and I believe what has happened is that we, from when I started raising money 20 years ago, or when people gave to me as an individual because I represented our community, and I was a trusted resource to invest dollars to make an impact, that we have really taken out so much of the human element and made so much of that transactional in so many different ways. So these are just some of the reasons, and some of the reasons we're in a generosity crisis, but there's a whole other side of the coin that Brian will talk about as well.
Thanks, Nathan. And whether or not we, the nonprofits, are the victim, as Nathan mentioned earlier, I was watching the chat when he was just talking, and you all are starting to hit on many of what is on the screen. And you're right. I feel like saying correct to many of the things you're pointing out. And so some of them are here. And so, like Nathan on the last slide, I'll just cherry pick a few here. One is the upper right. Some people have commented in the chat about this in different ways, but the disparity of wealth, the crowding out effect, i.e. when a billionaire or even a multi-millionaire gives a massive gift to a nonprofit, what does that mean to the $100 donor, the $1,000, even the $10,000 donor? When someone gives $100 million, it really has that, where's my money needed? How's it going? Where's it going? Hence that crowding out effect. I think the pressure with inflation, as I've seen in the chat, all those things. I mean, we could spend this whole session just talking about some of the headwinds, if you will, that are facing every sector, really. But how does it showing up in our sector, the nonprofit community? The annual decline in religious affiliation is important from our standpoint, simply because if you look at that, the annual decline of religious affiliation of any religion, it very much mirrors the line trajectory down of people giving. And so when you understand that, and then you understand the flip side of that, which is that those that historically have been affiliated with a faith or a religion ended up being, I think, 2 times, maybe 2.5 times more loyal, more supportive. So we're kind of taking the best historical supporters out of the equation as more and more people are declining, not to mention the habit forming, as I mentioned earlier, the generational aspect of learning how to give, learning how to tithe through religion within your family. As that framework is less apparent, less people will understand the importance of giving. I think the annual decrease in trust is a big one as well. I mean, I look at the nonprofit sector, and everything that we do, I think it's on the currency of trust. So as trust is eroding, I think the very game we play, meaning of trust, of if you give us your resources, we will deliver on feeding people, educating, health, etc. It's hard to believe we can continue to succeed at the levels we did if we're in a world that is less and less trusting. The second to last one I want to highlight on is, and Nathan already alluded to this, which is the changing in how people define giving or define generosity. Think of crowdfunding, for instance. That's not included in what we're talking about. And so people giving directly to one another is in fact booming. And it's not the traditional check writing giving to a nonprofit. In many respects, those models, the nonprofit is nowhere to be found. We're giving directly to each other. I mean, I had a personal experience, like all of you, of a friend whose house unfortunately burnt down, and the community really rallied and gave them money directly. I would argue nobody thought they were being less generous in that circumstance, but it's just something to be paying attention to as a nonprofit leader. But the biggest of all that we spent a lot of time on the book is the bottom middle here, the competition for connection. And want to just have a little fun here and think about, just as a baseline, let's even just understand how much time we have as nonprofits to make sure our message is heard, get through to some donors or some potential supporters. So we came across this little fun tidbit here. The average attention span of a human in 2000 was 12 seconds. Today, it's 8 seconds. So like giving, it's going down. And I think that's no surprise to everybody that we can hardly pay attention for 8 seconds to anything that's in front of us. And yes, that officially puts us behind goldfish, who have an attention span of 9 seconds. And so when you think about all the other headwinds that are in front of us, not the least of which is the connection piece. And yet, to us, as Nathan already alluded to it, what we'll talk about later as radical connection is everything. Connection is paramount to having trust, building relationships, getting support, and just know we're working in a backdrop that is probably the hardest from building a connection than it's ever been.
Yeah, so Brian was just sharing, that degree of our ability to actually pay attention is decreased by 25%. So even though we're talking about seconds in between, a 25% decrease in our ability to really pay attention has really had some remarkable effects on generosity. And there's so many great comments in here, and I want to talk about all of them actually, because and a lot of them are addressed in our book. From the transfer of wealth, which by definition assumes that the next generation is as generous as the prior. And the area of inflation, and that being kind of a main cause. And our argument would be that is essentially equating generosity to wealth, and at the core, generosity is about our kind of pro-social behavior of actually giving back regardless of wealth. And all of this to say, there's so many great comments, so keep them coming. We love it. When we get down to how we're in this situation, we're narrowing the lens and kind of zooming in on some of the critical areas that we need to be aware of, and then we'll actually share some ways of getting out of this. That in the era of more, and by next year, 2025, the average person will have around 5,000, just under 5,000, 4,909 to be exact, algorithmic decisions made on your behalf. So from the time you wake up to the time you go to bed, and even while you're sleeping, as your phone is working on your behalf, you will have interacted 4,909 times with data or interaction, some kind of data or algorithmic interaction. 20 years ago, that number was 293. We're talking about exponential technology that has an exponential effect on our ability to connect, on our ability to pay attention, and so on. This is really articulated so well by Tristan Harris, who runs the Center for Humane Technology, which is a nonprofit itself that really is shedding light on both the promise and the perils of AI. And in 2020, Tristan Harris came out with his highlight in the movie The Social Dilemma, and I think a lot of people have seen it. We were sitting around in our homes, not being at work, I guess, during the pandemic, watching The Social Dilemma. And he said this comment that algorithms are essentially rewarded by creating a race to the bottom of the brainstem. So an algorithm that does its job and is successful in what it did, it actually captured your attention for one more second. And when it does that, it actually rewards itself, and it creates a new competition for another second, another second, another second, which is why the average person scrolls 300 feet on their phone a day. But last year, and just in a few years, advances in algorithms and their ability to capture our attention, which is essentially what takes away our ability to connect, is that he stated this is no longer a race to the bottom of the brainstem, it's a race to intimacy. Now, again, another hair in the neck moment, because for 20 years in the nonprofit sector, I thought intimacy was what we held the moral high ground on. I thought intimacy was that sacred space between a nonprofit and a donor to achieve something that neither could do on their own. Intimacy was the thing that we woke up and went to bed about, thinking about how do we build this intimate relationship with the individual. But the part of this, the troubling part of this, is that Tristan Harris is not speaking to nonprofits. He is speaking to and about for-profit entities that are no longer interested in selling a product or a service, but are far more interested and valued in the stock market for creating intimate relationships with consumers that have maximized lifetime value. So what was the playbook that nonprofits had and we just took for granted throughout my entire career was absolutely flipped on its head. And we'll see that manifest itself in just some very simple ways. And Brian will share a couple examples.
So to Nathan's point, and tying this together in hopefully a clear-cut example, the competition for connection, when we look at these three, not even examples, these are actual mission statements, vision statements, and values of organizations. I mean, they kind of speak for themselves. They're pretty powerful, in my opinion. That we exist to save our home planet. We exist to fight for a fairer, more beautiful world, human rights and dignity, social justice, and environmental protection, restoration, regeneration, etc. As Nathan said, I would have argued 20 years ago, this would have been absolutely the language, the words, the mission, the vision, the values of a nonprofit. And in fact, they are the mission values of Patagonia, Body Shop, and Ben & Jerry's. And so to Nathan's point, there's he referred to it as the financial reward of intimacy. I mean, what I look at it is people are trading on values, and so the values that they're trading on became, if they get our values and they say to us, we understand who you are, we get who you are, because by the way, we are that. Patagonia, we stand for and we believe in what you believe in. Well, they know really well that that means the wallet will be there, the heart will be there, the mind will be there. But what I don't think they knew, which has been proven, is that if you buy, and I'm definitely speaking about Nathan now, if you buy a Patagonia vest or any product, it's been proven you will get the same dopamine hit that you once would have gotten when you gave a gift to a charitable institution. And that's when Nathan talked about that sort of dangerous thing that's happening, the dangerous place. I'm the biggest fan of for-profits doing the right thing and doing right by society, what have you. But we also can ignore the maybe unintended consequences of them putting some confusion into the marketplace of when I want to do good, where do I go? And if I can get a product back for giving money to a Patagonia and I get this dopamine hit, man, maybe I'll hang out in this space for the rest and not necessarily need to go and help a nonprofit to have the same experience. You want to touch on this, Nathan, or you want me to do it?
No, go ahead.
So and all that is to be said, and there's a great report that comes out every year called the Edelman Trust Barometer, and this is obviously 2023's latest report of it and the latest numbers. And this might be small, so I'll talk out loud about it. But they judge trust on the axis of ethical to unethical and competent, less competent to competent. And so if you can see at the very top where it says NGOs, nonprofits have always had the ethical high ground. And that's great. And that's probably, hopefully, comes as no surprise. What is interesting is you historically saw businesses, for-profits, down on the ethical scale, but certainly out further than us on the competency level. I think it's logical. It makes sense for what we've always thought. But look at the jump in 3 years. In 3 years, businesses or for-profits have moved up 19 points on the ethical line. And so that is tremendous, meaning tremendous movement over 3 years. So what they're doing is working. What used to be called cause marketing, it's now just marketing of their values, their missions, etc., has enabled them to keep the competency high ground and really, really close the gap on the ethical high ground from our standpoint. And for us, that's a dangerous place. One of the things Nathan and I often do is workshops after we give this talk. And one of the things I know Nathan loves to tell, and it's a great advice, is if there's one thing you want to take away from what you learned today, it's to go back to your nonprofit and organization and figure out how can we, as whatever your nonprofit is, how can we improve on the competency scale? How can we beat the for-profits, if you will, or companies at their own game, just like they're doing it to us as well? Because let's go back. This is the currency of trust. If we have it, we can move mountains. We can get volunteers, money, philanthropy, etc., and do all the great work. If we don't, we're really treading water at best. And so that was the backdrop for us to really begin to think about, okay, there's something going on here. The data is proving it out. We understand there's forces working against the nonprofit community. We believe this trust notion is a really important one that's also under duress, what we used to take for granted, as Nathan said. But there is absolutely hope ahead, and there's a solution, if you will, we put here, and we can begin to rethink this. We can absolutely turn it on its head for the solution, and in some regard, I would say go back to what we always knew to be true as nonprofits. It's just that in maybe in the last 20, 25 years, we may have lost our way. But when we turn it on its head and we get back to what we do better than anybody, which is, I believe, connection and building trust, we will be able to ignite the spirit of philanthropy, maybe bigger than it's ever been. We just have to acknowledge it. We have to be aware of it, and then we have to work to solve it. And for us, that was simply defined, not the craziest of terms, but in terms of creativity. But we really thought we needed something that we could land, a framework, 2 words called radical connection, is what we were saying needed to be reestablished. And we can establish that in many, many different ways, which we'll talk about. But radical connection, it's not a new term. Quite frankly, it's an old term that we thought needed to be brought back for it to have its day. And for us, this is an important slide. I feel like we can almost stop here, but I know there's many more things we want to cover with you all. But you have to understand. For us, we had to understand this mentally. This is the shift. This is the 180. This is the flipping it on its head. That generosity is actually the manifestation of radical connection, not the other way around. And I'll let that sit for a second because it's really, really important that generosity is the manifestation of us doing the right things to create an environment where radical connection is happening.
Yeah, well, let's double click on that for a second and also just go back and there's so many great comments on chat. Like so many of these comments could be their own presentation, to be honest. When we're talking about, ethics and competency of really the need. Now, hopefully everything, and again, often, hopefully you had your box of cookies with you, but often like everything we just shared is a lot, like, right? I mean, by nature, people that invest their career in nonprofit tend to be more glass half full. Like we have to wake up and believe that we can make a difference in the world. And I will double down on that and say the time has never been more important for us as nonprofit leaders, fundraisers, and everything in between to really lean into the work, really acknowledge what's not working, and really get creative about ways to envision a new future. And so, I reference a lot of my career in here because for a majority of my career, if I didn't stop to think about it, I would have said that generosity was a manifestation of wealth. And if I looked at the practices and was honest about the practices of how we identified better prospects or best prospects, I would have had to admit that we were prioritizing people based on their wealth. And so when Brian and I really came out with this book, it was written out of sheer concern, maybe some frustration by lack of movement and willingness to talk about the hard things. But when we really flip the pyramid, and we're able to prove this through data science now, which is awesome, we have to admit that people give because they have a varying degree of connection to you. And we're going to break that down. And what we're going to give you is essentially a framework that you can take with your organizations and essentially use as a litmus test for where your prospects sit. And so while we knew that the word radical connection might sound like a buzzword, and we fully admit that maybe it's not the word that everybody wants to use, it had to be something that was distinctly different than preference or association or affiliation, or even what we kind of term as connection in a kind of modern era. And what we started to do is break out, like, what are the differences between the things that I just happen to know that are, let's say, a preference or affiliation, or what are the things that I go out of my way for? What are the things that cause me to smile when I talk about it? Or if I'm in another city, I'll go out of my way and take a detour to be able to go see that restaurant, or for me, a Patagonia store in the weird far off place of the city that they always put them. Something that, what are the things that it's like, yeah, I'm kind of loosely affiliated with that, versus I look at my wardrobe and it's full of Notre Dame, clothing, go Irish. And so when we started breaking this down, what we found out that what we created was essentially a framework or a test where you could take and actually ask donors, like, where do you see yourself on a scale of 1 to 10? Is our organization something that's a mere preference of yours, or is it something that you love, or is it surface level, or is it deep, and so on? And we've been engaged in so many great conversations over the last year and a half where nonprofit leaders and fundraisers have taken this and actually stopped really just assuming it's like, oh, they're a good donor versus a bad donor, or a good prospect versus a bad prospect, that someone I should prioritize versus I shouldn't, without stopping to take the time and really assess where those individuals see themselves. And then only by then taking action to help increase and build and foster what we determine as radical connection. And by the way, when you have radical connection with an organization, because it's the ones that you brag about and you talk about and your friends know that you're affiliated with. And the donors that have radical connection with you, because no matter of the ups and downs within your organization or how many gift officers they might have had, that throughout the years, they have a visceral connection to your organization that stands the test of time. And what we're suggesting is not a more is more strategy, but much the opposite of a less is more strategy. Take the dividend of time that you get through technology, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and invest that in building and fostering these radical connections, because these people have lifetime value that's 20 times greater, mathematically proven, 20 times greater than a person who just gives a single gift to an organization. So again, hopefully this is some practical advice as well. So when we look at this, very similar to how we think of this idea of ethics and competency, and we're always reaching for that top right-hand quadrant. It's very similar with radical connection. Trust is at the center of that. There is no radical connection without trust. Sorry, I'm getting choked up because I'm so emotional about this topic, apparently. Is that we're really being conscious about your organization and assessing, without your own biases, and we're trying to remove your own biases about like, well, we do that and we check these boxes. What are the things that you're doing that are creating preference, the opportunities for people to prefer you versus just being aware of you, and areas where you're creating intimacy within your organization so that there is this kind of more visceral connection between you and a constituent and them and with you. And there are some basics here. And so actually, why don't you go, Brian? I'm like so choked up. I need to like just unwind here for a second.
You got it, Nathan. No problem. So yeah, Nathan said there are some ingredients that help foster the getting to that upper right quadrant, as we just talked about. These are three, as we've said a few times now, that we kind of unpack a bit more in detail in the book. But vulnerability and authenticity and inclusion. I saw a comment in the chat about actually when organizations get this wrong, when they look phony and they look fake, and how it has the complete reverse reaction and probably in 2-3x that. So I totally agree. These are not only essential ingredients, but there are fine lines, right? Being vulnerable, being authentic, being inclusive, all those things are important. And to varying degrees, depending on the organization. I think these are really important to understand. Are we being as transparent, as accountable as we should be, as we could be? Are we being as proactive and consistent by many stakeholders? And that's the one that certainly jumps out at me. This is a, to establishing a culture of radical connection. It is a daily, hourly thing. It's not a once a month thing, and it also needs to be understood and to have the involvement of many stakeholders. And Nathan referenced, I think we think the number is like 10,000 conversations we've had since the book has come out, and we've been traveling around the country and even internationally to Nathan. And for me, one of the big ahas when we were been in front of audiences like this and gotten feedback and hearing people just, how does this resonate with you? One of the things that really developed was this idea that this is, if you truly understand this, i.e. how to establish an organization that has radical connection alive and well, it makes sense. It's so obvious that this is not a development challenge. It's an organizational challenge. And as simple as that is, I wasn't there mentally. Even when we published the book, I thought this, let's make sure development directors read this. And I saw a comment go by earlier about getting their boards involved and getting their boards to read this. And I want to scream amen from the highest levels, because this does need everyone's buy-in. And quite frankly, you see it. The best organizations, whether they be a nonprofit or a for-profit, you just know it. You know they must have buy-in at all levels to be able to act the way they act and behave. And Nathan, we've talked about Patagonia, but he had an example one time. I think I don't want to, and I don't think it's embarrassing for him, but he was in New York, I think, and there was a rip in one of his gloves, and he went in and they replaced it. I mean, like the person on the ground at a store who has the ability to do that, there's trust, transparency within each other, but everybody's rowing in the same direction. And it's amazing what happens when organizations can get to that point. And on a personal level, as was read in my bio, after 22 years of consulting, I joined an organization, my alma mater, that I personally have a radical connection with. But I find myself understanding this even more and more so from the lens of sitting inside an organization now, that everybody's got to understand this, which we can't take for granted they do. And then they've got to buy into as much as humanly possible, or else this isn't possible.
Yeah. You can go to the next slide, Brian. The good thing here, and we're going to talk about kind of this from two different lenses. We're going to talk about it from a technological lens for just a little bit, because you're going to be able to hear from Chiri and Koshi tomorrow, I think, on AI. And so that will be great. And you'll get some really practical advice. We'll only highlight that today. But the other end of this is organizationally. And I saw Tammy's echo amen to this idea that Brian and I realized as we were going around the country talking to people, that nothing will change in everything that we talked about, no matter how much you believe in it, if you're only measured by how much money you raise, or if a nonprofit leader only keeps their job because they fill that leaky bucket. But there are so many practical things that we've seen in creative ways that come out of these sessions where we're just willing to hit the pause button, slow down, and talk about what would our organization look like if we prioritize relationships over revenue and money over mission, truly, and not just words, but what would it look like? Would it look like we were so confident in our donor experience that we'd offer a money back guarantee if someone wasn't totally satisfied in how we treated them? And that's an extreme example, but it's not a challenging example to think about. Like, if a donor gave us money and they weren't totally satisfied with how we treated them, that we would offer to take the full value of their donation and donate it to any other nonprofit of their choice. Think about, just from that mindset, all of the other things that you can unpack of just like the premium on personal touches now that you have more time because AI is making your life easier, hopefully, that you can essentially start your morning every day with writing a couple thank you notes, things that we always did and took for granted, but it's an opportunity to get back to. So why don't we go through, and I know we're going to run up against time. So
yeah. Well, and I'll just go through, and it's interesting you said that about quickly going through. So the next 3 slides actually are takeaways that we've had doing workshops in front of small groups, large groups. And so you'll get the thematic of where we've been about how this isn't theoretical, but this is as old as philanthropy. But it doesn't matter how much you ask for, when you ask, what you ask, how you ask, if you're not asking the right person to begin with. And I'll just say, when I met Nathan the first time, and I'm sad to say, I was a big believer for 15 years of consulting that wealth was everything. And when he said to me one day, "Do you realize that's 11% accurate at predicting a donor?" And my mind was blown, and I was like, wow, how have I been doing this wrong this whole time? That's lesson number 1. Number 2, Nathan mentioned this. What would an organization look like if we prioritized relationships over money, prioritize meaning over money and relationships over revenue, right? So we found ourselves challenging groups we've been in front of. Force yourself, think out of the box, put money aside for one day. I know it's important, but what if we put money, relationships and meaning and connection over that? What would you do differently? You might have different strategies all along. And this one was the ultimate for me too, which is going back to my consulting of through the lens of wealth. Think about it. The first week on every assignment, we would get a database of a client and do a wealth screening, and that's where we'd start our work. Could you imagine if we could understand and quantify the depth of a connection of a database? Think back to that quadrant where the upper right corner is radical connection. Could we map a client's database along the connection points and then understand those that have radical connection? How did they get there? What steps did they take? What role did we have, etc.? Just really freeing information and really fun to begin to think about how going about your job more effectively.
Yeah, and this brings us back full circle to almost where we started. So part of the reason we're in a generosity crisis is really that disassociation and that competition for connection that AI has actually contributed to a lot. But that same technology actually can help us understand people at an individual level. And we started using this term when I was in the nonprofit seat still at a cancer hospital, where we knew all about how precision medicine had changed all medicine forever, that people weren't categorized of having one type of cancer or one type of disease, that in fact, a therapy for one person might help one person and hurt another person based on their own DNA and their own genotype. The idea with precision philanthropy and this idea of leveraging the same type of technology that's being used to harvest intimacy at scale in the private sector is that it frees us from looking at wealth, and it allows us to look at what were all the conditions of a donor before they made their first gift. What were all the data points that we had in place that actually help us understand the motivations of giving? And the coolest part of this, and I've been so fortunate to work in the space since 2017 and pioneer a lot of new AI technology in this, is that we now understand motivations of giving better than any time in human history. In fact, we can solve questions that have been questions around philanthropy since Aristotle spoke about them 2,300 years ago. And it really isn't about data or models. It's about people being empowered by what you have available within your organization to make the most accurate and actionable insights or action at any given time. So while we won't be able to get into a whole session on this, because I actually gave an hour-long session on this morning earlier, that we are living in a new world where where there's lots of data around us, and it's frankly almost irresponsible for us not to use it as nonprofit organizations. Right before the session, we were talking about the dividend of time and this ability for, if we had the dividend of time because of AI, and I think Beth Cantor and Allison Fine talk about this in their book, Smart Nonprofit, is this idea that we could take that dividend of time and apply it toward building radical connection. And how amazing would that be? But our sector is still pretty far away. Our sector needs to really get, on the right side of the digital divide. While 89% of nonprofits agree that AI will make them more efficient, only 28% have implemented or experienced it, and only around 10% are using it to its greatest capacity. We have a long ways to go, but this is, again, this is a preach it moment, because our sector, there's a lot at stake. Things aren't going as well as they could go, but we have the ability to use technology to scale and foster generosity and connection in a way that's never been available before. So we'll actually close with just a couple first steps. Like, people ask us, and Brian and I both can share kind of our synthesis of all these perspectives that we've had over this last 14 months of having conversations. For me, it really is this, in the truest sense, of getting out of our own way and adopting this mindset that more is not better. One of the greatest things that we've heard repeatedly over and over again, whether it's a fundraiser or a leader or a prospect development person or a donor relations professional, is that it sounds like what we're talking about is not more is more, but like a less is more approach. And that's exactly it. If you took that away from this conversation, and what people take away from our book, is that it really brings us back to center, the things that we already know to be true, that people give when you can build that intimate relationship, and the technology that can allow you to do more of that at scale. It also means that we have to really challenge ourselves and our organizations on the check the box type of fundraising in philanthropy that we become so accustomed to, that a donor like this gets this treatment and another one gets this treatment. And while you have to use systems and processes to create efficiency, there is a lot of technology built into CRMs, and I know we have a lot of them in here because I saw Eric Tamales in the chat earlier, that allows you to do this at scale, getting away from check the box kind of mentality, and really get into what, in Virtuous, I'll just quote, calls responsive fundraising, which it really is, responsive to where the donor is at today and will be tomorrow and after that. And then the last, or second to last one, is really this come back to center. Like, this is where we just slow down. Like, we put on blinders to the things that are just more, that are creating confusion, that make us feel like we're competing for dollars, because we're not. We're competing for connection. And make sure that your KPIs are really focused on this part. And I'll end on this one quote that I love from Charlie Munger. And Charlie Munger is a business partner of Warren Buffett, if you don't know. And the simplest but most true statement ever is that he says, follow the incentives, so the KPIs, follow the incentives, and I'll show you the outcome. And while we know this is true, because people wake up every morning and they want to be successful, they will operate in ways that they're incentivized to operate. But if our KPIs continue to be focused on revenue versus how many people that were in my portfolio last year do I have again in my portfolio this year? So really looking at retention and lifetime value, not to say that money is not important, but focused, creating KPIs that really focus on retention and lifetime value ahead of just revenue. And so, and then, of course, everything that we've talked about, we only believe that technology should be used if it's used and it prioritizes trust and connection. There you go, Brian. Sorry.
Great. Yeah, no, thanks, everyone. And so in closing, just to let you know, on our website, which is generositycrisis.com, we developed some free resources that I think we've heard from people they find helpful. They range from conversation starters around generosity with friends, family, coworkers, etc. The middle is actually a book club guide. There's been a handful of book clubs around the country that have sprouted up about the book. And so we wanted to make sure we kind of put our 2 cents in about maybe how to frame those conversations. And then lastly, 10 ways to foster radical connection. Just a little bit of a poster, a little reminder every single day about how to continue to bring this to bear. As we talked about earlier, this is definitely something you want to be working on daily. And whoa, this got screwed up on a formatting, but these are our without wanting to be connected to as many people as possible and hear your stories and figure out how we might be able to, with all the research and homework we did on the book, how might that be, brought to bear through all of your relationships and friendships and conversations. So thanks again for the time.
I want to say again, thanks to Tammy. Tammy, thank you so much for seeing, from getting to know us, for kind of seeing the vision, for letting us amplify the messages around the need for change in our sector. And Brian and I love to connect with people on LinkedIn. So find us on LinkedIn. We tend to post about these things quite a bit. So just truly appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Well, I'm sure Tammy would give you a thank you for that, Nathan. And thank you, Brian. That was just a very insightful session, a very busy, very buzzy chat. I know you were looking at that a bit while you were speaking. So we have a couple of minutes here for some questions. So you just wrapped up with a little bit about the book. This question is about your book, so let me go ahead and ask. It is, does your book explore the origins of the charitable sector in Calvinism and how that's impacted the way we view charitable spending? Specifically, the negative attitude towards nonprofits who invest in marketing, innovation, anything other than their programs, and how that has limited our ability to expand our reach and recruit new donors.
Wow. That sounds like the start of a new book, actually. So whoever wrote that, kudos.
That's from Riley Coe.
Let's, grab a drink and have a really interesting, fun conversation. So, Brian, how do you want to respond?
Yeah, Nathan, I was going to actually ask you to maybe chime in on one thing and then I can take it back. What about the John Deere, when you and I were out there, their research budget? Because I just want to give scale to what other companies, and then I'll come back and give a comment about nonprofits. Go ahead if you want to.
Yeah, you can see how this works. I always give the hard questions to Brian and then he punts them back to me, but we'll see how this goes. No, Brian and I last year was so interesting because from a CSR, ESG, cause marketing kind of perspective, and kind of that how people perceive that either positively or negatively. Last year, we were actually invited to go to John Deere headquarters at the request of the local United Way, who brought together a lot of, two parts. Actually, in one night, they brought together business leaders to really talk about the generosity dividend from this idea, and they actually called it the generosity dividend, this idea that there's a role and responsibility for business leaders to give back into their community. But one thing we learned during that was that when we talk about R&D and talk about reinventing yourselves, this is a 100-plus-year-old tractor company that actually they started out making plows with stainless steel, is that they invested last year $1.6 billion in research and development. So a 100-year-old tractor company, and we don't think that tractors change that much, is always trying to reinvent themselves. And so we just thought that was just stark contrast to that. But as a company who also donates very generously in their local community, it was so empowering to see how they brought together all of the other business leaders, competitors, and others alike into their headquarters to really learn around that role and responsibility of giving back. So, Brian, what else were you thinking?
Yeah, I was going to piggyback on that and say, we talked briefly about boards. And we've had as I said earlier, through workshops and we've had a lot of conversation about the role of boards in this, and the good or the bad that many board members bring their for-profit mindset to, i.e. the goal-oriented, putting them to their nonprofit board leaderships. And I was thinking, and have been talking to all the other people, that therein lies what might be the answer. None of them in their for-profit, and Nathan just gave an extreme example of John Deere spending $1 billion a year on research and development. One of them would run rarely would any of them run an organization without an R&D budget, even if it was $10,000, $100,000. And yet there is next to zero in the nonprofit space. And so the innovation that needs to get done, what I have found, now that we've been at this for a little more than a year, people who have read the book, who've brought us back or brought us in or written us emails that said, I was able to change the conversation with my board. I was able to reframe it. Or donors, because the question was specifically, I think, about the overhead question. And I think it gives more context to the overhead answer. That is an important one, it's unimaginable to think of the impact, the great work that nonprofits can do without professionals, without resources, and I go to Nathan's comment because it was kind of a joking manner, but the explosion in the use of AI for people to get more time back in their lives, I think is a really interesting development over now and into the next 3 years. Not answering the overhead question, just enabling the overhead, i.e. people, other things to be more effective at the work they do. I think it's going to be a really interesting phenomenon over the next couple of years on how nonprofits are viewed.
And two other books that I'd recommend. One, if you're really interested in the origins of philanthropy from like beginning of Western civilization, it's a book called Philanthropy. It was funded by a foundation. It's exhaustive. It's a few thousand pages, just so you know, just like buckle in. So that's one, kind of just like the most comprehensive, like study on where we're at today and kind of this philanthropic capitalism that we're kind of living in. And the other book is Winners Take All, which really dives in probably from a more glass half empty side of the role of how corporations and foundation or corporations have leveraged philanthropy to benefit themselves, but haven't really increased their level of involvement. So two additional books, because Generosity Crisis should be your first.
Well said. Well, and again, there's more questions pouring in, guys. I have the tough job of saying,
Yes.
We're out of time, and we want to be sensitive to your time. But since you so generously mentioned, let people reach out to you on LinkedIn. It seems like some of these questions could, Heather, your question, Michael, your question, maybe throw it in a LinkedIn, connection request to Nathan and Brian, and I'm hopeful that we get those answered. But a segue here, someone did, Lee Jackman says, book ordered. So as we thank you again for your time and your content today, before I let you go, we do want to announce the winners from our drawing for your book. So we are going to be giving away, 3 copies of your book that we've all been able to see over your shoulder there, Nathan, today. So our first winner, we have Lisa Breitsprecher from Mount Mary University. Yay for Lisa. Our second winner, we have Badisa Ray, and they are from Blink Now Foundation. And our third winner of your book is Liz Ninehouse from Gracious Crowns.
Awesome.
Great.
Forgive me for any surname butchering, but you get a good prize out of it. So we'll make sure to get mailing addresses and all of the good things so that you get your copy winners there. So this completes our Generosity Crisis session. I will tell everyone to head on back to that lobby and prepare for our next session with Brooke Ritchie-Babbage. That's starting at 2:45 p.m. Eastern. And in the meantime, you can join our wellness break for 8 minutes. And that is stretching at your desk with Alicia Archer. And you'll still have some time after those 8 minutes to grab another caffeine source, bio break, all the things. And remember, you will need to click to join that wellness break, as well as Brooke's session when it starts at 2:45 Eastern. So again, thanks, Brian. Thanks, Nathan. We really appreciate you today.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care, everyone.